Hi and welcome to the channel. Today we are going to build another SFF PC using this SSUPD Meshroom D. I bought this for $99.99 which makes it competitive in terms of pricing. This is also traditional in terms of layout and so you don't need to buy a riser for it. That saves you a couple of bucks. In terms of compatibility, it can fit an ITX motherboard, the CPU cooler is up to 142mm, GPU length is up to 323mm, which is not bad. For PSU, this is also compatible with SFX and ATX power supplies. As for fan mounts, it can be quite complicated. You can mount one slim 120mm fan at the top, but do note that something might hinder it. For example, in my build, the tubes from the radiator. The left side can also have mounts for up to two 140mm fans, but this is where you also mount your radiator. At the rear, you can also mount an 80 or 90mm fans if you don't want to mount an SSD. At the front, it states that it can fit 120mm or 140mm fan. Though based on testing, you won't be able to secure a 140mm fan properly. What's not written here is at the bottom right side, you can mount two 80mm fans or one 90mm fan. As for 2.5-inch drives, you can mount up to 6. But again, depending on your PSU chosen or tubes from your radiator. All of this for just 15 liters in volume. Anyway, upon opening the box, you'd see the case padded by a thick foam. And the case is covered by a plastic bag. And it's basically mesh on all sides. At the front, there's two USB 3 and one USB-C. At the back, there's a power button on the top right corner. And there's also an SSD or fan slot here. There's 3 PCIe slots and cutout for the motherboard. To open the case, you need to pull it. However, I find it hard to pull, especially that I've just cut my nails. Anyway, it's basically toolless to remove all removable panels. The accessory box is tied to the case. Inside are zip ties, a bunch of screws for fan, HDD, and SSD, and another set of screws for an ITX motherboard. There's push pin socket replacement, so in the event that your case has its push pins removed, you can replace it with these. There are also multifunctional brackets, which by right you can mount a fan here, and a manual. As for the cables, there's a power extension cable, USB-C, USB 3, and a power front panel connector. At the bottom, there's dust filter, and it's pretty much hollow, which was surprising. To build, you basically need to remove all panels, the sides, top, and front. Looking at the manual, I noticed that this is not for Meshroom D, but for the Meshroom S. And then noticed at the top that this is indeed for the Meshroom S. Upon opening and flipping the manual to the other side, I then saw the page for Meshroom D. I think it will be confusing for some, but anyway, their manual is also online for easier viewing. After removing all panels, remove the radiator mount, which is secured by 4 screws. Next is to remove the PSU mount, and this is secured by 2 screws on each side. The PSU mount can be mounted on either side and to the front as well. Based on the manual, you'd prefer this if you have an ATX PSU. This way, the PSU will not block the GPU. Anyway, as for the motherboard, I'll be using the Asus ROG Strix B650E-I. Processor is a Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. RAM is a G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo RGB 32GB 6000 megatransfer CL30 RAM. I then tried to place the motherboard to the case, but the extension cord is blocking it. But based on the manual, the extension cord should be directed away from the motherboard. In my case, this goes towards the motherboard. My motherboard will definitely not fit. To mitigate the issue, I just reoriented the power extension cable, plug the 8-pin CPU power connector to the motherboard, and route it to the back of the motherboard. Align the motherboard to the case screw holes, and then screw the motherboard to the case. Plug the front panel switch, USB 3, and USB-C. To mount the PSU to the PSU mount, ensure that the orientation is correct first. I've set it to get the air directly from outside. Screw the PSU to the PSU mount, and you'd notice here that the PSU is too small for the hole, but you can still secure it with 4 screws. And then screw the PSU mount to the case. You'd notice here that I didn't plug any PSU cables first, which is kind of rare for me. But because the bottom is pretty much hollow, it should be fine. Moving on, there's also a nice gap between the PSU and the motherboard, so I can plug the 24-pin power connector at this stage as well. I then plugged the power extension cable to the PSU and turned on the PSU. However, I routed it wrongly, so I unplugged it first and routed the cable to the top of the case instead. Plug the CPU power connector, the 16-pin PCIe power connector, and finally the 24-pin power connector to the PSU. The manual states a few cable management options, but I think this is unrealistic in my case as I have short cables. Anyway, it's time to mount the rear 90mm fan. After that, install the two 80mm fans at the bottom right side portion of the case. Note that it only has one screw per fan. After I install the fans to the case, I remove the rubber padding to align properly. The tolerance is too tight. I tried to install one back but I don't think this is necessary. And then route the fan cables to the top of the case. Based on the manual, you can also mount a top fan with their multifunction bracket. But I didn't pursue it now as it will block my views to the case. Anyway, plug two Y splitters, one in CPU fan header and one in case fan header. Plug the rear fan to the Y splitter for the CPU. I then plugged the two right side fans to another Y splitter and then connected it to the case fan Y splitter. Next is to install the cooler. Screw the standoffs to the backplate, apply thermal paste to the CPU, screw the mounting clips to the pump block, screw the pump to the standoffs, and then plug the pump to the AIO pump header. However, do note that in this position, the tubes are too long and will be an excess to the case. This case is a bit slimmer compared to the NR200P, so it doesn't have much room to wiggle on this side. Given that, SUPD actually recommends to have the tubes run from the back side. With that, I removed the pump header and then flipped the pump upside down. I then put the ARGB cover of the AIO to the case and screwed fans to the AIO. As for front panel cables, I routed it to the right side of the case and then on top of the 80mm fans. This way, it won't block the GPU. There's also some space between the PSU and the motherboard to tuck the 24-pin power connector. Screw back the top radiator mounts to the case and also the bottom radiator mount. However, if you look at the manual, it will ask you to remove the front left bracket. The reason for this is to easily fit a long GPU to the case. However, I know beforehand that my GPU isn't that long, so it shouldn't be a problem for me. Anyway, it's time to screw the radiator to the radiator mount. At this point, it is best to test your fan if it will spin, especially considering the clearance between the components and the fan. Now plug the radiator fans to the Y splitter that is connected to the CPU fan header. It is also time to plug the ARGB cable to the ARGB header. I then tied the loose cables to the case for some cable management. Again, I usually don't cable manage, but since these cables might hit the fans, it is better safe than sorry. As for the GPU, I'll be using the Gigabyte RTX 4070 Ti Super Gaming OC. But before installing this, remove the PCIe covers first. Now gently slot in the GPU to the PCIe slot of the motherboard and then screw the GPU baffle to the case. Looking at the right side fans, the clearance is just right. Now plug the PCIe power connector to the GPU. I then proceed to secure the radiator to the radiator mount. Anyway, I think there's a small issue if your GPU is a 4090 as the power connector is bent. Moving on, install the front fan to the case and then plug the front fan to the Y splitter. Make sure that the fans are spinning without hindrance. The final hurdle is the 16-pin power connector. I just tuck it to the bottom like so, install the dust filters, front panel, top panel, and side panels, and the build is done. As for testing, I tested this in 5 configurations. Basically, a combination of the right side and front fans in intake and exhaust mode. These 4 configs have the radiator fans in intake mode, and then I tested the AIO in exhaust mode together with the right side and front fans in intake mode. With Cinebench R23, the CPU temps ranged from a low 86.32 degrees Celsius with radiator fan intake right intake front exhaust configuration to a high 87.59 degrees Celsius with radiator fan exhaust right and front intake configuration. It is worth noting that the gap between configurations at the extremes is just 1.27 degrees Celsius. However, the DeepCool CH160 performed significantly better at 84.39 degrees Celsius even with an air cooler. With Cinebench R24, the CPU temps ranged from a low 82.5 degrees Celsius with radiator fan intake right exhaust front intake configuration to a high 83.37 degrees Celsius with radiator fan exhaust right and front intake configuration. It is worth noting that the gap between the configurations at the extremes is just 0.87 degrees Celsius. However, the DeepCool CH160 again performed significantly better at 80.65 degrees Celsius. With FF15 in 4K, the CPU temps ranged from a low 65.07 degrees Celsius with the radiator fan intake and every case fans as exhaust configuration to a high 68.78 degrees degrees Celsius with radiator fans exhaust and right and front fans as intake configuration. It is worth noting that the gap between configurations at the extreme is already significant at 3.71 degrees Celsius. And generally, having the front fan as exhaust improved the temps by at least 1 degree Celsius. DeepCool CH160 sits in the middle of the pack, but do note that this config is the so-called worst CPU cooling config but had the best GPU cooling config for gaming. As for the GPU, the temps ranged from a low 67 degrees Celsius with the radiator fans as exhaust and both right and front intake fans configuration to a high 72.67 degrees Celsius with the radiator fan intake and every case fans as exhaust configuration. This is somewhat an inverse of the CPU temps, but do note that right side intake fans generally perform better than their exhaust counterpart. The reason is likely due to the turbulence created if the right side fans are in exhaust config. As compared to the open test bench, there's around 5 degrees Celsius difference as compared to the best config and more than 10 degrees Celsius against the worst config. It is again worth noting that the DeepCool CH160's best GPU config performed slightly better as compared to the coolest Meshroom D config. As for the GPU hotspot temps and fan speeds, those just scaled linearly. For my recommended config, since my focus is usually on the GPU, I'd go with the radiator in exhaust configuration. The bad thing in this config is that it may be harder to maintain as dust will build up in between the fan and the radiator. But do note that the right side intake and front exhaust config also performs good on average in terms of CPU and GPU cooling. It is second place in both regards. I do know, however, that there are few configurations that I missed out in this build. First is flipping the case upside down, since flipping might improve the GPU thermals, having more air access. Second is air cooling configuration, which can also improve GPU thermals by having an extra fan at the top. Third is rear fan in intake mode, which may improve the overall airflow, especially in radiator exhaust config. As for my tips in building in this case, I suggest removing any rubber padding from your 80mm fan to easily fit two of those at the right side of the case. As for dislikes, in general, SUPD provides a complex compatibility matrix, given that their manual and their website are sometimes out of sync and it may be too hard to get the right information. For example, the Meshroom D page tells us that we can fit a fan at the front, but it was not mentioned in the manual. The manual mentioned right side and top fans, but those weren't mentioned in the Meshroom D page. I am still also not convinced that it can fit a 140mm fan at the front as well. Again, not in the manual. Going out of topic, their riser information for Meshroom S is now page 404. As for the likes, compatibility-wise, I should say that SUPD doesn't want to waste space. If it means that we can fit an SSD, they'll have mounts for it. The GPU compatibility isn't bad as well. And again, there's some more to explore with the Meshroom D that I haven't yet. There's also an extension bracket which will add around 2 liters of volume but will make it MATX compatible. It may also help in GPU cooling since you can now mount thick 120mm fans at the bottom. As compared to the DeepCool CH160, DeepCool wasted around 3 liters of space at the PSU side while also having less GPU compatibility. But with that, DeepCool was able to fit in 4 120mm fans, which definitely helped in GPU cooling, but more so in CPU cooling as can be seen in the Cinebench benchmarks. DeepCool is available locally in the Philippines, but may not be available in North America. While Meshroom D is not available locally in the Philippines, thanks to Amazon, I was able to buy one easily. There's no import tax as well. However, DeepCool is selling for cheap $55 only, around half the price of the Meshroom D. Overall, Meshroom D is an okay case, but I just find the value of DeepCool CH160 to be more compelling. Anyway, that's it for this video. Do let me know in the comments below on what you think of this case. Thanks for watching. Do like or dislike and subscribe for more unboxing, SFF builds, and benchmarks. Bye!